At the introductory part of the New Testament. We've been finishing up the last steps through. In your handouts, it should be number 38, 39 range. That's from about 2 weeks ago is when I got into your emails. And we'll probably move into 39 today. And the one I sent out Friday is really looking forward because as we get into the last section of the study, we're going to spend a little bit more time paying attention to areas that we maybe overviewed or examined broadly because they have a more visual and important connection to the work of Jesus. And so we're really trying to pay attention to how all these places and historical details then make their appearance in the New Testament text. Before we get into our study this morning, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, we'll have that prayer together and then we'll begin our class. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in spiritual things. We thank you for your word. We thank you for all the factors and forces that have been in place to bring your message to us. We're thankful for inspiration, for the labor of copyist and scribe, and for the work of historians to bring it all together. In all things, we hope that our study enriches our faith so that our faith can be active in the lives of our experiences, our motivations, and the way in which we interact with others. Help us share that faith with those that we meet and demonstrate the love of Christ in our speech and our behavior. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, again, so we're paying attention to that bigger narrative of the story as we look at all the details. Note that we kind of picked up last week as we are in the introductory sections of the approach to the crucifixion. Visually, you need to kind of set your mind's eye on a very small area of geography or space by the time we get to the last week of Christ. This entire endeavor takes place probably in a space no bigger than 2 or 3 football fields. And so everything you're looking at, if you stood on the edge of the retaining wall of the Antioch fortress or even the edges behind the tabernacle, you could stand there and you could see the entire scene of events that take place involving everything that's going on with Jesus. It's all present there. Especially if you're looking at a modern map of Jerusalem, which we'll probably do a little bit as we go back through the story and a couple key points. You can stand on one of the upper parapets, and then you look to your left down, you would see the Wailing Wall. To your right, you would look over and see what's called Old Town Jerusalem now. But that's the area which Jesus walked through place to place, where Cyrene, or Simon from Cyrene comes into play and carries the cross of Jesus, the upper spar section, as he goes in his last steps from one of the series of trials until his crucifixion. So textually, we're approximately Matthew 27. On our timeline side of things, we're in the last week of the life of Christ as it leads up to the crucifixion. And we're looking at the area around Cyrene. You'll note that this pulls in an individual from the upper or the lower edges of the Mediterranean. And so that circle that surrounds the sea is the full world space that our individuals in these stories come from. He's not the only outsider in these stories, too. We'll see a few others as we look at the New Testament's recording of the book of Acts. And we'll see individuals coming from these other regions as well who are in Jerusalem for various reasons. They are often, in this case here, because they are present to sustain their commitment to their faith. And then Jesus would then be crucified on a rock. Place of the skull is what it's sometimes translated. Golgotha is another term for it. As I said last week, I'll say again really quickly. Over the years, you've probably seen folks pull up images from around Jerusalem. One of the most common is one of the rock facings that demonstrate, hey, it looks kind of like maybe there's a skull in the rocks. That is 100% not the place where Jesus would have been crucified, because it's nowhere near the areas where everything else took place. There's no time available for him to travel from one to the next. This place is just a rock that looks more like, as I said last week, the dome of your head. That's why it's referred to in that regard, not because it's the facial front of a skull. And it then becomes a point of significant influence later in history. Our next big question has to do with the place of Jesus' burial. Note that it's in close proximity to everything that's going on. It's outside the old walls of Jerusalem. And that tomb was owned by whom? What's the guy's name? Joseph of Arimathea. What makes him special besides his name?
Follower of Christ.
Follower of Christ. What's his economic background? He's rich, relatively speaking. That's uncommon in the dialogues concerning Christ and his disciples. Most of those who followed Jesus openly, that's our first group of things, were not from the wealthy context of Israel's circumstances. They were, like we've been pointing out, and you can look at our mapping section, most of them were from the northern section towards Galilee. If they were from other areas, they were also from equally depressed context and circumstances. So to have a follower who was wealthy, this individual by himself, is incredibly unique. The majority are not. Further, he's taking a step that others who were wealthy and wanted to follow Jesus hadn't taken. Some were like, I can't be open about my faith. I'll believe, but I can't make that next step to go forward with it. He's very bold in his willingness to take someone who has now been identified as a troubler, captured and executed under the idea that he is a terrorist, and is in opposition to the emperor and to Roman rule and local deferred kingship, and said, yeah, he can be interred in the grave that I have prepared. That's a big deal. It's a small bit of the story, but it's a big deal because now he's willing to connect himself with everyone that is there. It's a big commitment on his part. One of the other stories, we'll talk about this as well a bit next week when we come back to some of these details, is we're looking now post-crucifixion. We can think about it in the process of the resurrection. And in those circumstances, we get a series of visitors to the location of this expensive grave. Of note, the early ones who are bringing back the report are the women who come back with a first look at things. Then that message slowly spreads, and you have different responses to it based on the disposition and attitude of the recipients. But the angels told the women of the tomb that Jesus was going to be where? Where's he at? Is he going to be found at the tomb? What did they expect to find there? What was the women's goal when they went to that tomb, by the way? Yeah, they want to make sure the body. That's because, by the way, there's in Jewish burial rite procedure, there's a process that takes place. Most of us have probably already experienced a few funerals in our lives, and we kind of are commonly accepted to, this is what we do. There's the funeral home does a lot of preparation ahead of time, based on the family's wishes. It might be an open casket or a closed casket. And then, unless you're in a flood zone, nearly all burials take place where the body is then buried underground. That's a standard, basic concept. In Israel, and more so broadly in the Mediterranean region, most of these are sequential funeral concepts where Phase 1, there's a preparation side. That could be any number of layers. In this case, it was often wrapping and robing with all additional herbs. But also then the next phase, that would be moved from there into some sort of boxing, whether it was dug out of the ground or actually formed up above ground. The body would be placed there. And you can think about it in terms of putting lye in there with the body in order to accelerate the decay of the flesh. Because the next phase is that body would then be from bones only, moved into an ossuary or a box. And that box took a lot less space, and those would be entombed in a variety of ways. And that process would scale in intricacy based on wealth. So the wealthier a person is, they would be in a new tomb, to a new ossuary, to a new final place of rest in the longest stage of things. And so they're going to continue this process. What they're expecting is a body in the process of decaying. And that's a unique thing. If you've never been around someone who has personally, like you've seen them pass when you're there, it's a different kind of experience. Your nose notices first, even if it's a recent thing. It's a very quick process that the body odors start to manifest in new ways, and then it continues down the process. And so that's why all of the herbs are in play. That's part of the reason there. Historians also suggest that process is connected to the history of Israel and Egypt as well. That they picked up some practices that continued with them through their history. The account of the Great Commission, recorded in Matthew, was given on a mountain where? Where's that mountain? I'm going to do awkward silence this morning. Yeah, they had been told to meet him where? If you go back just a few chapters, and up in Galilee, and they're told to go back to Galilee. That's where they're going to see him again. I want you to think about the way in which the apostles responded to what we now read as these very obvious direct statements concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Because the apostles, pretty much uniformly, as Jesus goes to the cross, their response is, this Jesus movement is done. Our rabbi, our master, our friend, our Lord, he's gone. That's their behavior. They weep, they deny, they curl up like a little ball and just don't even know what to do. And Jesus' statement says, I will see you again. We read that now and go, hey, why didn't they figure it out? Two things to be of important note for us. Well, number one is their faith is maturing in these processes. Their ability to trust the statement of Jesus is going upward. But secondly, we are getting a history presented to us that includes whatever it is the Holy Spirit brings to their remembrance. So, you can answer this question or not based on your own disposition. Last time you went to your grocery store, how many of you had a list but still forgot something? And yes, I usually have a list, but it's not a very good one. In my case, the list doesn't stop me from getting things that are not on the list either. All right? So, but I'll still forget something, even if it was on the list or otherwise. A point to recognize is even if you say something directly in the hearing of somebody else and they really trust you and love you, as a human, you still might forget it. And you probably won't have a deep clue as to what it means because you're hearing a lot of things, especially when you think about what Jesus is trying to impart to them in a very short period of time. He's teaching them regularly. It takes a long time for complicated things to sink into anyone's mind. So, quick review. This is your pop quiz. They do appear from time to time. Where was Jesus' first miracle? Let's go. This should be like a gimme answer. Cana, right? And by the way, what was that miracle? Water to wine. And when you first read the text, does it really seem like he's all in on doing it right then? Keep in mind, there's a complicated context for that dialogue. He's not just acquiescing to his mother. He's also he's working within the confines of God's big plan. And there are things about the biggest part of the plan that even Jesus himself does not know. Time nor day. And so there's a layer of corners of authority in that relationship and that dialogue that's taking place. One other quick point to that. Remember, that miracle is not about us trying to figure out what is an appropriate beverage. A lot of times you try to look at it and go, hey, is this teaching us about sobriety? There are other great Bible passages that teach that, and they're awesome. And they give us all that instruction. I mean, that's where we go. This is Jesus literally doing what the text says. He turns water into oinos. And I just don't know, and it doesn't tell us what kind of oinos it is. We have to reason that out. You're not going to find it in the grammar and literature of the text. But what you do find is Jesus opening up an amazing beginning to a big story that has its fullness in Christ. And here he's literally doing what it says. Water turns into oinos, which is perfectly fine to call wine. But keep in mind, the Bible then tells us whether or not we should think wine is a great beverage. And the answer is not really. Even modern medicine now helps us understand that for the most part, it's basically poison, the alcohol side. Jesus pronounced judgment on 3 cities. Awkward pacing. First city that he pronounced judgment on is Bethsaida. Second one, this comes from the Gospel of Matthew, if you're looking back earlier in his work. This one sounds, this is a gimme, it sounds a lot like what you might find at a taco stand to put on your taco. Because they put chorizo on a taco. And so it could be corazin, chorizo. I'm trying to help you out as much as I can. I can only go as long as possible. This one we've seen a couple times in the Bible narrative. Last one is Capernaum. Where is it that Jesus walks on water? Yeah, on the Sea of Galilee. By the way, it's one of my favorite places to go. If you're going to visit Israel, make sure you go there. It's because in part it's the least changed. It's still the same context and circumstances. And if you stay there over a course of a day, you're going to find contrary winds at some point or another. And so you get to see what it's like when the water turns to chop. Caesarea Philippi was a site of what event that would unfold at Pentecost? What do we know about Peter? What's that big thing he does? Hey, Linda, can you make your phone chirp? Doesn't it make a rooster sound still when it makes a text message? Yeah, so this is where the story comes in of there's going to be the sound of the rooster crowing. And I want you to think about how that impacts not just Peter. Because Peter himself is no different than the rest of the apostles in this response. He's just the one who we see his emotions play out. But how many other apostles are up there at the crucifixion? Are all of them there? No, just as far as we can tell, one who loved, one whom Jesus actually had a deep affection for and was entrusted with the care of Mary. And so there's a whole conversation that takes place with Peter in that case that also demonstrates the bigger picture of things. Hey, your faith is going to be demonstrative of greater faith. It takes place at a location that has a high history of idolatry. There's a big rock wall behind him. And so that's why that dialogue of the rock takes place. What is the boyhood home of Jesus? Nazareth, right? It's not a wealthy area. It's not a highly populated area. But he was notable to a certain degree because of his father's profession. So where is the story taking place from the woman of the well? What's the context there? It's a little uncommon name. We don't talk about it in the Bible for its location. It's Sychar. And where did Jesus teach on marriage? Perea. It's good to kind of catch some of these details from the remembrance standpoint. What is the birthplace of Jesus and David? This one's a gimme. This one, it's been on the quiz, on the pop quizzes before the services 4 or 5 times this year. That's going to be Bethlehem. And where was Lazarus raised from the dead? It's another town that begins with the letter B. Bethany. And then where does Jesus have his conversation with Nicodemus? If you're following the sequence of the questions, you might figure out that this is in Jerusalem, in the outskirts of it. And then finally, his ascension takes place where? Takes place at the Mount of Olives. From our vantage point, we'll see the Mount of Olives a couple times, not only in the story of Jesus, when we go back and look at some of these sites in detail, but also it'll reappear in some of the stories surrounding the apostles. The Mount of Olives is a great kind of circular point for thinking about all these stories, because from the edge of the Mount of Olives, you can now include in your aerial perspective view, seeing all of Jerusalem, including the city of David and the old city. All right, let's see. Let's go ahead then and show a bit of that. So this kind of scoots forward. I want us to pause for a second. We're going to go back and incrementally over at least the next week, maybe the next 2 weeks, and pay attention to the physical locations in the Gospel of Matthew. As we kind of tie these places, because before we look at the text and the map, but now we'll add a little archaeology to this. This is a photo taken, I think it was like around 2011, 2012. This shows the Wailing Wall. You've probably heard it referred to that way. What it actually is a structural retaining wall. Rich, we need to figure out whoever designed this wall for your yard, because man, it's doing great. Even it survived. This particular part of the wall even survived the destruction and did not require much rebuilding. And so, from the sense of its stability and strength, it's doing really well. Of course, it is built out of big blocks of stone, and we get Carson out there to move them around for us. Those blocks of stone are bigger than me in height and weight and dimensions and stuff. That might be one of the reasons why it's doing so good. Cost might be prohibitive for us to build that here, but that's what's still here. So that wall, it's not the temple. It's not the temple in the sense of the temple that was rebuilt. It's not even near, per se, that original temple space. It's not near the temple space under the Solomon-spaced temple. This is part of Herod's great expansion, where he basically built, we can think about it this way, a series of stone decks that go out around the temple. And so if you're building a deck around the house, you build a whole support system underneath, and you build this big flat space next to whatever you want to be around. And then in its original presentation, it was surrounded by arches and then cloth canvas coverings to keep the shade down until the trees grew in. Some of those arches are still there. But this now is the location where still to this day, Jews from every nation under heaven still make a pilgrimage at different times for different reasons, not just in order to follow the strictures of the law, but for other reasons and offer prayer. So when you approach this wall, in the cracks that are there, there are small little rolled up prayers that are placed into that wall by all of these Jewish families. And you can kind of tell it here if you notice somewhere around the center line of the letter T, They've taken it away right now, but there's actually a dividing spot right there. For most of the time, outside of Pentecost in certain contexts, this is actually gender separated. And so, in those two walls there, Israelites are going, Jewish, particularly those who are practicing their Jewish faith are going, putting their prayers. About every 3 or 4 months, those who are serving in certain official roles for the state go through and clean those papers out. And so those get taken care of some other way. I think they actually just burn all of them. But that's a regular practice there. This is an illustration of what's going to eventually go on in this picture of the story, and that the gospel's message is going to expand. For our purposes right now, I want us to think deeply and kind of as much of a rich attitude as we can on how a message that goes from all the way out here. Remember, we just talked about Peter's confession and the dialogue concerning Peter's eventual disturbance of his faith. That is, there's going to be the rooster crowing, which comes up in the next kind of phase of Peter's development. This looks down into the valley from where that dialogue took place. And so you have a huge shift that goes on. This is looking from all the way up on the edge of Galilee, looking down to the Lebanon Valley into Samaria. And so this is a movement that's going to go from the outsides to the insides in the development of everyone's faith and disposition. That is, the little ones who are despised and rejected are going to be given a seat at a new table in a new kingdom. But it all then centers back around Jerusalem. All right, so before we get back into looking at some of the prophecies in this matter, let's pause for a second and ask some of our 5 questions. So we've had about 2.5 weeks to review the Gospel of Matthew and the life of Christ from its historical and geographical context. Do you guys have any things that you liked when you were paying attention to the story from that regard? Did you notice anything new when you were paying attention to the story of Jesus in light of the land or the sequence? Or we can go to the second question. What did you like or didn't like? Those are the ones that are easier. That's the lower status one. I'll tell you about it from my perspective as I think about reading this story in different ways. And one of the things that I really like about reading through the story of Jesus from the standpoint of the geography is it does 2 things for me. Thing number 1 is sometimes it changes my preconceptions, where I imagined a thing to be a certain way, and then I learned that, hey, that actually can't work that way because the distances are shorter or longer, or the context is a little different. That's helpful for me. But also, because of the way that I learn, it's really valuable to me to be able to place myself in the spot and to visualize being there. That helps me remember it better than just making a list. Because as I've already evidenced, even a list doesn't keep me from forgetting things. So I really benefit from looking at that physical side. What else for you guys? What are some pluses from looking at it this way? And if you're visiting with us, you don't have to pretend like you were in the class the last 2 weeks to participate that way. But if you want to jump in, you're more than welcome to. Trenton?
It's kind of like when someone gives you verbal directions on where you're going, right? Sometimes if you don't know the area, you tune out a little bit, right? You're like, hey, just give me the address, I'll plug it into Waze or whatnot. But for me, it brings, even just looking at maps, and we talk about the size of Jerusalem, it brings out all that kind of makes sense when, you talk about the journey that Jesus took from the garden and then through all the way to his crucifixion. It actually makes, I guess it makes more sense as opposed to just saying, hey, he went here and here and here. We can actually put eyes on it. And not that it wasn't real before, but it's easier to visualize in your head.
Yeah, one of the things I think for me like that is paying attention to a topographical map, a 3D map that shows elevation, because any flat map, no matter what it is, has to slightly distort the image to fit on the page. It has to kind of squeeze it in a little bit because some things have important differences. So knowing, in this case, that you can stand at the Mount of Olives, or stand at the edge of what they consider the Garden of Gethsemane, which is probably the same one that Jesus was in his context, and look over the temple is really important. Like it's not like you're looking eye to eye with it. You're actually able to look a little bit over where the temple's top spires would be. And so it's an elevated position, because a lot of times when I was first reading the stories of the temple, I always imagined that that particular piece of dirt was the highest point in all of Jerusalem. It's not. In Old Jerusalem, it is, but Old Jerusalem was surrounded by hills on the outside. And so that little spire point then is viewed from the bowl around it in a new way. That also changes the way you think about how Jesus interacts with other spiritual beings, because this will affect our perspective of Jesus' discussion about his place with the devil, with Satan. Because the devil will take him up on different spots and show him things. And now we're seeing that, hey, the devil's actually only giving him a little bit of a limited view when he takes him up to the edge of the temple, the horns of the temple, to have that presentation. Still not fully recognizing the deep power and nature of the Messiah in that dialogue. This is a deep double question, and there's a surface level for us for today, but also this will inform our classes for the rest of the quarter for this section. What sections or subjects do you want to know more about? I like to do that regularly. We used to do that quite a bit when we were doing our textual studies. But are there aspects of this subject that we haven't covered enough in depth for you? Or things you just don't understand? And I can also ask the question I asked the 8:30 students sometimes: have you had enough caffeine yet to start your day? And has that caffeine had enough time to do its job? The answer almost unequivocally is no for a lot of folks, but some of us are weird and get up early and are accustomed to it. Awkward silence is your friend. Let me add this, and then we're going to move back into our text and pay attention to two of the biblical passages that are important for the book of Acts. As we go forward and we kind of close out our big picture on this, you will note that when we get to November and December, you're going to have some reviews. We're going to review everything we've looked at. So they will not necessarily be pop quizzes because they're in advance, but we're going to look at everything from Genesis to Revelation from the standpoint of what we're paying attention to. And when we look at the text of Revelation in this class, we're going to make a couple of quick notes in regards to how John uses geography and history to create the framework of the message that God gives him. Because John's message from an island to people on the mainland is understood best when we realize that he is making points about current culture and past culture for Israel. Right now, if you want, you can turn your Bibles to the text of Daniel. And this is a segue text. It connects the two things. It will eventually appear also in our reading of the book of Acts as we kind of go along with the class as well. But I want you to pay attention to Daniel chapter 2, in particular, verse 44. The Bible there records, in those days, or in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Matthew 4 echoes the same truth. From that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That Daniel text is coming out of a larger story. What's that larger story from the text of Daniel? What's the imagery that's above that final event? My feet are kind of sore. Maybe you can think about soft feet in this story a little bit too.
That's the dream interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
The large image that is made of various different materials.
Right. Starts off and we're really it changes the matrix, the makeup of the material as it represents different kingdoms. From our geographical standpoint, you're going to kind of connect how these stories of this kingdom also swing from our Between the Two Rivers, Mesopotamia area, to the arrival of an empire that is not in that same region. It does not predict or connect so much to the idea of technological advancement, which sometimes folks are talking about, because it's an image designed to teach about the nature of these kingdoms, not about a predictor of the content of lifestyle in those kingdoms. Because they're all going to be subsided, squished, and eradicated by a different kind of kingdom. From the mindset of listening to it, this story gets interpreted at least three ways. Way number one is that what you see in Israel amongst those who are not looking for a king like Jesus. They'll say, oh yeah, a king's coming. And he's going to just be more than, but still earthbound. And so you have the interpretation of that level that says, more down but earthbound, that is, our kingdom will be like Solomon's, it will be like David's, just more. In fact, it'll be so big that it's going to be the biggest of all the kingdoms, and that's how it's going to crush. And so there is a look at this story that says this is super literal. Here's a point to think about. How many times have you struggled to understand a prophecy of the Bible because you were locked into the idea that it had to be super literal? It happens a lot. And then later down your reading of the Bible or later down in your life, you realize that, hey, God wasn't thinking about this term in terms of these people or these are literal things. That's nothing new. You get to see that. Second level of interpretation is that this is some sort of system that can be disrupted. That there's things that people can do that can stop the arrival of the kingdom. And you see that level of interpretation both in Israel and elsewhere amongst those who seek power. Whether it is the Roman leadership who says, oh, well, if we kill the king, then the kingdom can't come. Not really rationalizing that, look, if this truly is from God, there's not much we can do. We can either go along or get along. And then you have those who are truly looking at it in a messianic way, and it's a very small minority. They really are looking for a new type of king. Super small minority historically saw this as looking towards something more. But they existed. They were just a minority in history. So this is the point where then the intersection of the text connect, where Daniel chapter 2 connects to Matthew 4, and Jesus is preaching a new kind of kingdom. Because you can see that in his message. Because when we get to Matthew 5, that's a whole counterculture message. It is one that directly and explicitly rejects the ruling powers in both Rome and Israel. It does so by turning tradition on its head. It does so by adjusting the way in which the world seems to function for all of Israel in that way, and calls that those who are low will now be invited into the kingdom, when in many ways they had been excluded. Also keep in mind this whole area that we tend to think of as a monotheistic block, that all this area is super infested with just one view of spiritual mindedness. It's just Israel. This is a huge mix of everything in this area. You have the presence of those who had come up from Egypt over the years in captivities or as slaves or as conquerors. You have Roman powers, Greek powers, All of the Mesopotamian regions have also come down in this area. Israel's people had been scattered and brought back in series and intermingled with the nations around them. So much so that the overwhelming dialogue concerning Israelite faith takes place in the Greek language. Hebrew is known, is understood, but the literature of what we call the Second Temple period is nearly exclusively Greek. And the translation that Jesus quotes from in the Gospel of Matthew is a Greek translation of earlier Hebrew scriptures. So everybody there is basically predominantly speaking Greek. Now that's a clue that this kingdom is now a bit different. It's also interesting, and this is like a side note to catch, that this passage here in Daniel that we're bringing in comes from a book which is kind of unique in the Old Testament, and when it's not just Hebrew, it's Hebrew and a second language. The language of the Mesopotamian region is brought in here as well. And so around the middle section of Daniel, it changes out of Hebrew and then back into again because of their Babylonian status. The language changes. The message changes there a little bit too because the focus shifts. Additional things of importance as we kind of reflect on it before we get back into our geography side. Jesus himself made a clear promise to Peter that these kingdom keys are going to be handed over. Jesus told Pilate, considering his nature, he's born to be a king. Think about John chapter 18. My kingdom is not of this world. So he is not denying that he is part of a kingdom. If my kingdom, now he's taking ownership, were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." This is as bold of a statement as Jesus gives in this process. But he does not back away from the reality that he is a king. But it's very clear when we read it with kind of the opened eyes of the big picture that he's saying, yeah, I'm a king, but I'm not the kind of king you think about. In part because if that was the case, then my servants would be fighting to keep me out of your hands. But my kingdom doesn't function like your kingdoms do. That's a message that's a struggle to sometimes process. And Peter is a great example of that because he clearly doesn't want that. While he may appreciate a larger kingdom context at some levels, his initial behavior is, don't capture my king. Don't take my king. Don't harm my king. That's how we all behave. It's a human response to struggle and trial. Let's go ahead and pause right there, and I'll make this note. What we're going to do next week is we're going to go back to the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to pay attention to about 5 or 6 historical sites that intersect with that review we just did to get a closer understanding of each of them as they relate to the story of Jesus. So we're going to be looking a little bit at the temple space. We're going to look a little bit at the Garden of Gethsemane. We're going to pay attention to some of the areas where Jesus is preaching around the valley area, including the presumed location of the Sermon on the Mount, and the interaction between Jesus and Peter after the resurrection, where Peter willingly tosses himself into the sea when he sees the risen Lord later in our New Testament text. And so that will be next Sunday morning. Thank you, everyone.